Right on cue. Wonderful. Right. Welcome, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you. Well, here, I'm in my sitting room, but good to be here with you all in this Zoom talk. And thank you very much to Archaeology Scotland for hosting this. It's one of many, many events going on for Scottish Archaeology Month 2022. It's an annual event, as you're saying in the preamble, not just in Scotland, but across Europe. There's events going on this time of year. So lots happening in Scotland, hopefully something not too far from where you are. So I would encourage you all to take part. And this is just one aspect of that program. And the reason I think we're all here this evening is because of stories. Fundamentally, that's what gets a lot of people interested in the world of fantasy, and that's what gets a lot of people interested in history and archaeology. It's absolutely incredible the number of historians and archaeologists I know who I've asked, what got you into this profession? And they say, oh, my parents read me The Hobbit when I was growing up, or oh, I read, indeed, Song of Ice and Fire as a teenager, and that got me interested. It's amazing how many people go into history and archaeology through the lens of fantasy. So that is what I'm hoping to channel for you here. And to start off with, again, the reason we're all here, I think Tyrion Lannister said it pretty well. He says a lot of things quite well, give him credit for that. He says, what unites people? Armies, gold, flags, stories. There's nothing more powerful in the world than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. That was at the end of season 8 that Tyrion said that. I was really chuffed about that because a very similar line actually opened my book that this talk is based off of. So I felt a little bit of vindication in having that be the start of my book and the end of the Game of Thrones series. Nice little bit of serendipity there. But I think that, there's a lot of truth in that. I think from the first time a fictional story was told, if we want to set up that binary of fictional or non-fictional, which I don't necessarily agree with, but first time a story was told around a fire, hundreds of thousands of years ago, I'm sure that the people who heard it went searching over the distant hills to find the truth of it. So that's what we're kind of here to do today, to find a little bit of the truth behind the Song of Ice and Fire, and hopefully inspire you to go visit some historic and archaeological sites for yourself, because I will be referencing a number of them throughout the talk. So hopefully you'll find one that is not too far off for you. Just circling back to what I said a moment ago, this is the book that really got me into history as a kid in suburban Canada. You can probably tell from my accent, I was not born in Scotland. I moved here about 11 years ago now. I'm living in Edinburgh, but in those sleepy suburbs, there wasn't a whole lot to do, for me anyway, other than read and have things read to me. And yes, okay, I know I'm here talking to you about Game of Thrones, but it was Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit that started my journey down the road where I ultimately am now, and I'm sure that many of you can relate to that. Now, the way this talk is going to be structured is along the same lines that my book is structured. So there's 5 fundamental sections, and you can think of each comparison that I'm going to make between the events of Westeros, Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, call it what you like, and Scottish history. One of those sort of angles is inspirations. So as you can see with Stannis having a go at Robb Stark there during the quite traumatic Red Wedding. Inspirations are things that George R.R. Martin directly took from Scottish history, and that we can prove he directly took from Scottish history and wove into his stories. On the other hand, there are parallels, and if anything, that's almost where it gets a bit more interesting, because while the inspirations are great for winning a pub quiz about Game of Thrones and Scottish history, if there is such a thing, I would totally go to one if there was, hint, hint. The parallels are where we get into the really meaty stuff of actually understanding the ebb and flow of history. That's where we find out what effect warfare had on the common people. That's where we find out what kind of personal dynamics influenced leaders to make the decisions that they made. So inspirations on one hand, one for one sort of, yeah, he got this event from this thing in Scottish history, and parallels, these more broad thematic things that we can look to better understand Scottish history as well as the world of Game of Thrones. So the first part of this is on the land itself. So we're looking at a bit of geography, the way that geography has fundamentally shaped the histories of both Westeros and Scotland. Part 2 is called Stories of the Stones, looking at some of the built and tangible heritage in Scotland that speaks to themes in Game of Thrones, as well as what we find on the ground in Westeros. We're then going to go into Part 3, which is Players of the Game, looking at individual characters and the people who may well have inspired them. Part 4 is the Wheels of War, looking at warfare and the impact upon people and political systems that it has, and how it's conducted, how battles were fought, all that kind of sort of quite bloody and mostly exciting stuff. And Part 5 is the Laws of Gods and Men. So that's getting into some of the norms that we have in society, the taboos that are broken in Game of Thrones as well as in Scottish history, and some of the beliefs as well. So Part 1, getting into a little geography. This is a very fun map. I did not make this. Someone much earlier and more clever made this. Realized right off the bat that if you were to take Westeros and you take the mainland of Britain and then Ireland and flip the ladder upside down, it forms Westeros pretty much perfectly, right down to those strands going off from what's the southwest of Ireland and what is right in the middle of Westeros there with the fingers where Littlefinger, Lord Baelish, is from. So in geographical terms, the comparison is pretty one-to-one. Even the position of Hadrian's Wall relative to the position of the wall in Westeros is pretty much bang on. But of course, it's not just Westeros, and Scotland and Ireland aren't just floating out in the middle of an ocean far away from anything else either. They were once, in fact, connected to other larger land masses. This is a map showing Westeros side by side with Essos, the much larger continent off to the east. And the little bit of highlighted down at the bottom there with the red circle are the stepstones. And these are a series of islands that are sort of strung out like stepstones, hence the name, between Westeros and Essos. Now, they weren't always islands. In fact, before the breaking of the waters, which was several theories for how that happened in Westerosi lore, but one is that the children of the forest got concerned that they couldn't possibly defeat the men who were invading Westeros back in the mists of prehistory in this world. So they called upon their magic and actually flooded the lands to sever the continent where the first men were coming from, so that hopefully they could cut off the tide of reinforcements and win the war. Didn't go so well, but that was the idea. And we do have a parallel to this in reality, which we have to go quite a few thousand years back to get. But first, just a reminder, the stepstones have seen quite a lot of action in House of the Dragon. It's where Daemon Targaryen went up against the brutal crab feeder, who I've given you a screenshot of here. So just to jog your memory, that's the area that we're working in. It's the same area that a lot of the action in House of the Dragon has taken place in over the last few episodes. The equivalent here is this vast, now sunken continent called Doggerland, going back to around 8000 BC. The area that we call Britain was actually connected directly by land to the rest of continental Europe. You could walk from what is now Belgium to what is now London in just a couple of days. There are a lot of theories for why this changed. There was possibly a large slip of ice off the coast of Norway, which resulted in a sort of cataclysmic flood, which would give your parallel to the flooding of the waters, or known as the breaking of the waters in Game of Thrones. But generally, we have a pretty sort of almost apocalyptic event, cutting one continent off from another. At least I'm using the word continent loosely there, but I hope you follow. That area is now, of course, all submerged, but the water in a lot of Doggerland is quite shallow, and there are some fascinating archaeological discoveries coming out of that area showing that it was quite densely populated. So whole civilizations almost certainly would have been wiped out at the time that these waters rose, and it's something that would have been instilled in communal memory for many, many generations to come when it did happen. Another sort of one-for-one parallel in terms of geography is how Westeros and Scotland are quite constrained with a pinch point right in the middle that became incredibly strategically important. What you're looking at here is the Frey Castle. Boo, Freys, we don't like them, right? So that's the Frey Castles of the Twins, which go over the Green Fork of the River Trident, if we want to be specific. The River Trident is a massive river flowing through more or less the middle of Westeros, cutting off the north from the south and vice versa. And the Freys, many, many years ago, realized that if they built a bridge guarded by two strong castles, one on either end of that bridge, they could make a lot of money and gain a lot of political influence by controlling who could go across the river at that point. Unless you had a huge fleet of boats waiting to take you across, the only way to get from north to south or vice versa in Westeros was to go hundreds of miles around through a very boggy area filled with lizard lions and all kinds of creepy crawlies. That meant you probably wouldn't have all that many soldiers left by the time you got to the other side. So it is well worth your while to negotiate with the Freys, whatever their price, and cross at the Twins rather than go around. This is the location of the Twins in Westeros. You can see it's right at that pinch point in the land where the continent is at its most narrow. So you really don't have another option other than to either go by sea or to negotiate with the Freys at the Twins. This is a mid-13th century map of Britain. And you might notice a similar pinch point if you look about 4/5 of the way up. There is a single bridge crossing over a body of water, which in the medieval period was known as the Scottish Sea. That's the Firth of Forth. Here it's showing that the Firth of Clyde and the Firth of Forth are pretty much connecting at Stirling Bridge, which we know is not the case and probably never was. But up until the 18th and 19th centuries, the area around Stirling was far boggier and far more treacherous than it is now. So if you had a large army, whether you were the Romans or Edward I, Edward II, right up through to Cromwell and the Wars of the Jacobites, you really didn't have much choice other than to go via Stirling to get from north to south or vice versa. So whoever controls Stirling effectively controls the flow of people and especially armies throughout the landscape. And that is why Stirling became what I call a crucible of Scotland. It really was the place where so many nation-defining battles were fought, whether we're looking at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, most obviously, Bannockburn, Sauchiehburn, the Battle of Sheriff Muir wasn't fought too far off, and it was fought with the intention of securing Stirling for the Jacobites. So time and time again, we have this pinch point in the land defining much of the history of the age in Scotland, just as the Twins did in Westeros. Here we see another equivalent in Westeros, which is Moat Cailin. It's a large fortress which is at the Neck, which is this very, very boggy stretch of ground, very reminiscent to what the area, the Carse of Stirling would have been until the 18th and 19th centuries. And in Game of Thrones, we see a handful of pretty sickly, worn down Ironborn fight off an army, at least for a while, of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. So it goes to show you the numerical advantage that can be conferred by gathering in a fortress like this. And really right through until the modern period in Scotland, if you wanted to make a stand somewhere, Stirling, if you controlled the castle, was probably the best place to do it, especially if you were outnumbered. Here, of course, is the castle today, in case anyone needed a reminder. The Wallace Monument just off in the distance there, the Ochil Hills, and very nearly showing the site of the Battle of Sheriff Muir off in the hills in the distance there. Another fun geographical parallel, which will probably earn you a few points in that Game of Thrones pub quiz if it ever does come along, are the place names of the Iron Islands. The Iron Islands are where the Ironborn come from. They're the sort of proto-Vikings, although I would make an argument that they're actually much closer to the Lords of the Isles than the Vikings proper, but that's another story. Here you can see a few names which might ring a bell. Apologies if you can pick up on a barking hound outside, although maybe that just adds some atmosphere. We can see Old Wick and Great Wick. Now, of course, there is the settlement of Wick in Scotland, but it's a much older Norse name, probably meaning something like bay or safe harbor. So that is probably more generally borrowed from sort of Scandinavian and North Sea history. But there's a couple that are a bit more obvious than that. We've got Orkmont, not a far cry from Orkney, and Harlaw, referencing the Battle of Harlaw, which was fought between the Lords of the Isles and various earls in Aberdeenshire in the early 15th century. So not a whole lot to dig into there, but just a couple fun little comparisons. Going now into the built heritage. I figure as this is Scottish Archaeology Month, this is probably a bit that you're all quite interested in, so we'll dwell on this for a little while. The whole concept for Game of Thrones and the whole Song of Ice and Fire came from George R.R. Martin's visit to Hadrian's Wall, which is, of course, entirely in England in 1981. And you can see the quote here. He stood atop Hadrian's Wall and wondered what it would be like to be a Roman centurion from somewhere else in the vast Roman Empire, not knowing what would come out of that frozen north from the mist screaming at you. There were all kinds of things that they imagined were coming out of those mists, just as there were all kinds of creatures like snarks and grumpkins that the people in Westeros tell their children and grandchildren about to try to scare them into good behavior. You know, you better be good or a snark is going to get you. Very similar things happening here with the Great Ice Wall in Westeros. Now, the thing about the wall, at about 700 feet tall and over 900 miles long, is that we, of course, don't have any parallel in Scotland or England to anything of that scale, not even close. But what we do have is, of course, Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. A lot of people sort of skip over the Antonine Wall. I think Hadrian's Wall was the end of the Roman world in Britain. Far from it. There was the Antonine Wall, and then far, far beyond the Antonine Wall, you had the Gask Ridge fortification system near Perth, and indeed Roman marching camps going all the way up to around Inverness. So it is not the case that the Roman legion stopped at Hadrian's Wall and said, right, that's far enough. In fact, they advanced much, much further north than that. But the important thing about the wall is that it doesn't represent anything literal in our world. It represents how people in the classical world and the medieval world thought about fortifications and barriers like Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. I know there's nothing worse than someone reading out a long quote to you on a slide, so I'll let you browse that at your own pleasure. But the gist of this writing from Procopius of Caesarea, writing in the early 6th century in what would then have been part of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, was basically, he was writing about Hadrian's Wall, and he said that you literally could not take a single step north of Hadrian's Wall without dropping dead. A few things lived beyond it, like ice snakes and other strange beasts, often evocative of death, at least in the sort of Christian mythology. But he said, literally beyond there, no people can survive. It's an icy world of death. And that is sometimes, admittedly, how Scotland feels, especially around the end of February. But it is really more so representative of how people thought about these sorts of frontiers. It's the metaphor of what they represented, which was far, far greater in the imagination than it ever was in reality. And that is really what George R.R. Martin was trying to capture with the ice wall. For instance, here we see the lands to the north of the wall looking pretty inhospitable. There are jagged mountains, just a sliver of sunlight, the trees thin out as you go further north, dark brooding clouds overhead. I would not want to be stuck out there, especially overnight. But when you look to the south of the wall, as Egret and John did when they climbed the wall, all of a sudden things are looking quite a lot nicer. There's a little bit of snow, but it quickly gives way to grass and pretty lush forest. There's still mountains, but they're not nearly as sort of treacherous looking as the mountains to the north. And there's a whole lot more sun. It's literally the difference between death and darkness on one side of the wall and light and life on the other side. And again, that is what George R. Martin was really trying to capture. Admittedly, what we have left in Scotland is slightly more modest than the great 700-foot ice wall in Westeros. This is one of the best surviving sections of the Antonine Wall, namely at Rough Castle in Falkirk, not too far from the Falkirk Wheel. I highly recommend, if any of you are ever in the area, to go for a stroll around there. You can really see sort of the ditch, which in fact would have been in front of the wall. The wall would have been built up on the raised area to the left of the picture you're looking at. They also had things like lilia spikes put in pits in front of the wall as an extra barrier. So the Antonine Wall was not built out of massive blocks of ice like the wall in Westeros. It was built mostly out of turf, with some areas with stone foundations and timber as well, unlike Hadrian's Wall, which was largely a construction of stone. This is a reconstruction of the fort at Rough Castle by the wonderful 3D artist Bob Marshall. If you're not aware of his work, go check out his website. He does absolutely incredible reconstructions of historic sites. So if you want a Scottish Archaeology Month treat, you can easily lose yourself for a couple hours in the details of Bob Marshall's illustrations. Going now to castles, one of my favorite subjects, of course. Hopefully got some good castle hunters out there as well in the audience. This is a pretty fantastical looking castle. It's one in Westeros. It is Pike, the main and most powerful castle in the Iron Islands. So again, that set of islands roughly equivalent to the Norse and the Lordship of the Isles off the northwest of Westeros. It looks pretty unrealistic. Looking at that, you'd think, come on, there's no way that anyone would have been able to build a castle, anything like that. They're on sea stacks, for goodness sake. I mean, what is the practicality of building a castle that is so precarious and which erosion is probably going to sweep away any moment? Well, while it is scaled up, and George R. Martin did say of his process of making fantasy that he would sort of take real history, jumble it all up, turn it up to 11 and change a couple colors. That's how he created his fantasy world. Here we can see the real history that he dialed up to 11. This is Castle Sinclair Garnago in Caithness. If you've not been, it's an absolutely incredible site. It is surrounded by several sea stacks, and you do have to actually cross over a small bridge in order to access the main tower of this castle. So not quite as unbelievably epic as Pike, perhaps, but still goes to show you that people were not afraid of building in what we now regard as quite hazardous, precarious areas. Now, it is important to note that with a lot of castles on cliff tops like this in Scotland, coastal erosion has been a big factor. So there are some castles which look like they're pretty much going to topple over, but 500 or 600 years ago would have been at least a couple feet further back. The challenge of coastal erosion to archaeological sites is a ongoing and urgent one, especially in areas which are lashed by strong tides like Orkney. So that is an interesting angle of environmental conservation that I know a lot of archaeologists are out there are working on right now. Another example of another Caithness clifftop castle is this. It's Bucholly Castle. You do have to be slightly mad to actually go out to it. I have done, but only when I had other people around and when I was being very, very careful. There's a tiny, narrow defile that you have to sort of scramble up to actually get into the ruins of the tower. So to be perfectly honest, for reasons of conservation and safety, I don't recommend that you actually try to do that. I'm certainly not going to in future visits. But again, just shows you the precarious position of some of the castles and the ingenuity that must have been used by the architects to build in such places. Not so fantastical after all. This is the Stark Castle of Winterfell, probably aside from the Red Keep, the best known castle in all of Westeros. A lot of people that we root for, or at least most people root for in Game of Thrones, spent a lot of their life in this castle. It is by far the strongest castle in the north. Now, I had a bit of fun with this one because I was looking at examples of castles in Scotland that were broadly comparable to Winterfell. And there were a few key points that I narrowed down. Winterfell was originally built on a bit of a rocky crag. It doesn't look particularly dramatic in this photo, but the old castle of Winterfell, which was a timber construction, was built on a bit of a rocky bluff, which the larger castle that you see in this picture just kind of was built over and subsumed. That's why it doesn't look much like it's built up on anything, but it was originally. Winterfell also started as a rectangular tower, a keep, and it was slowly added to over the centuries with courtyards and round towers and external curtain walls being added over the thousands of years that it existed. And I thought, okay, built up on a bit of a rocky bank, you've got the sort of central keep radiating out into courtyards with domestic areas like gardens. That does seem kind of familiar. And trees as well. Of course, the heart trees growing in Winterfell, and we've got yew trees growing in several castles in Scotland. And so putting it all together, Craigmillar Castle is the closest match to Winterfell of any castle in Scotland. And I actually had this confirmed by George R. R. Martin himself, which was a nice little moment there. So I don't know if he's visited or not, but certainly he saw elements of truth, at least in my theory, that this is the closest match to Winterfell. It too was built up on a bit of a rocky bluff. If you go around the south side of Craigmillar Castle, you can really see that in action. It too started as a rectangular keep, which was eventually abandoned and sort of in favor of these more domestic courtyards radiating out at the side. There were pleasure gardens as well around Craigmillar, so like Winterfell had gardens that were kept warm even through the deepest, darkest winter. Craigmillar Castle had orchards and a pond shaped in the letter P for the Preston family that was there. Mary Queen of Scots enjoyed hunting and hawking at Craigmillar Castle, so it was a formidable castle, but also a place of leisure when it needed to be. So that is, by good ways, the closest parallel, even down to the yew tree growing within the courtyard of Craigmillar Castle. And to me, I can just totally imagine Arya Stark climbing up that yew tree, scampering up onto the walls of Craigmillar, and Ned Stark having to shout her down. I've seen many children indeed climbing up on those trees during my visits to Craigmillar, which is always nice. One of the things I really appreciate about the castles in Westeros is that there's not just one kind. So often in fantasy series, you have these huge castles, which are, you know, the ancient stronghold and such as such a family, but there's not really any other castles. It's like, okay, there's this vast land and this powerful family, but they've only got one massive castle. That seems a bit off. In Scotland, we have no fewer than the remains of 2,500 castles. You heard that right, 2,500 castles in various states of repair, with tangible remains still visible on the ground. If you want to look at the ones that are completely erased and include those in the count, we're probably looking north of 3,000. And the vast majority of those were not these massive baronial or royal castles. They were tower houses and smaller houses belonging to more minor members of the nobility. For instance, in Westeros, we get a nice parallel here, and you're looking at Smailham Tower in the Scottish borders. There's a wonderful moment where Jon and Ygritte are just wandering south of the wall, and Ygritte, being a wildling, had never been south of the wall. She'd never seen anything even like a tiny castle, never mind a massive one like Winterfell. So she saw a very, very small sort of ruinous castle, and she thought, oh, wow, that must be where, you know, your king lives, like the most powerful person in this land must surely live there. And John's like, nah, it's just a little tower house, no big deal. And that is the reality of the castles in Scotland, that any noble family or even, you know, wealthy farmers, didn't have to be members of the nobility, would have at least small fortifications like peel towers or tower houses. And if you are on the search for those kinds of castles, the Scottish borders and Aberdeenshire as well, in a very different architectural style, are the best places to go searching for them. On now to part 3, looking at some of the players of the game, some of our favorite and often least favorite characters as well. Both make quite exciting comparisons. Good old King Robert Baratheon. Seen here, just bemusedly watching a joust, drinking out of his horn. He was in Westeros, of course. I know it gets confusing when we're talking about two kings with a very similar name here, so I'll try to keep it straight. King Robert Baratheon was really a warrior king, and once the wars stopped, he didn't really know what to do with himself, so he spent his days feasting and drinking and all kinds of other ings that I can't mention here without getting a restricted rating on HBO. He really defined himself on the battlefield. Off it, he didn't quite know what to do. And we see some of the trouble he gets into with the more sort of political intrigues that sort of go over his head. But fundamentally, in the form of Robert Baratheon, we have a warrior king and someone who actually forged the nation as they know it through the act of battle. If not for the battles won by King Robert Baratheon, namely the Battle of the Trident against Rhaegar Targaryen, the Seven Kingdoms would not have looked the way that they did at the time that the Game of Thrones show starts. The parallel here, you've probably all seen it coming already, is this man. This is a recent facial reconstruction of King Robert the Bruce. would not want to go toe-to-toe with him, that's for sure. Battle-hardened is a understatement. He fought in many, many battles, quite often right in the thick of things. He lived alongside his troops, often under canvas, so just camping or out in the open, especially in the days around 1306, 1307, when he was on the run. He saw a lot of hardship, but he really did, at least in our popular imagination, forge his reputation through battle. He, of course, is the victor of the Battle of Bannockburn, where around 7,500 Scots managed to triumph against around 20 to 22,000 English soldiers under King Edward II. Now, one of the reasons that happened, and they were able to do that, goes back to the earlier point about geography and Stirling. It's because he knew how to pick a battlefield, and he picked the grounds around Stirling with its bogs and with its narrow river passages to hem the English army into that narrow, constrained area where their numbers didn't really count for much. So very savvy tactician. And we have a comparison with one of Robert Bruce's greatest triumphs, the slaying of Sir Henry de Bohun at the Battle of Bannockburn, with an event in Westerosi history, the slaying of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen by Robert Baratheon. At the Battle of Bannockburn, King Robert the Bruce saw Henry de Bohun, a better equipped English knight on a massive war horse. De Bohun thought that he could just end the war right then and there by taking down the King of Scots. So this is one version of the story. There are several, but I'll go with the best known one. De Bohun charged headlong at King Robert. Robert thought, right, I can't just retreat back behind my men. What kind of example would that be? So he rode out against Henry de Bohun and allegedly stood up in his stirrups and brought his battle axe crashing down on de Bohun's helm, splitting the English knight from crown to breast. Pretty grisly end for poor de Bohun there. Here we have, again, Robert Baratheon just about to slay Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Robert Baratheon preferred a giant war hammer rather than a battle axe, but he struck Rhaegar Targaryen right in the chest with such force that the diamonds in Rhaegar's chest plate scattered all over the ford of the river. And to this day in Westeros, that area is known as the Ruby Ford, because people thought they could still perhaps find one of Rhaegar's rubies lying around. So that's the battlefield equivalent, and got a little ahead of myself in mentioning King Robert the Bruce and de Bohun there, but that's a popular illustrated depiction of their encounter. Off the battlefield, Robert the Bruce was a much more capable king, thankfully, than Robert Baratheon seemed to be. For instance, he orchestrated massive endeavors of statecraft, like the Declaration of Arbroath, as well as the Treaty of Edinburgh, which got a very temporary, but still a peace between Scotland and England. So he was much more of a statesman than Baratheon, but even still, we have a king fundamentally forged on the battlefield. Although we shouldn't be too hard on Robert Baratheon, because he did have his moments of contrition as well. Here we see him lying on his deathbed, having been skewered by a boar, and he realized that sending assassins after the child princess, Daenerys Targaryen, was not the smoothest move in terms of nice things to do, and he felt regret about that. So one of his last actions was to recall his assassins. Ned Stark tried to implement that, but all kinds of shenanigans ensued, to say the least. So there's some evidence that Robert Bruce did have a little bit of that sense of, you know what, I've done a lot of damage in this world, maybe I can do something to try to reel it back. On to a more recent comparison. This is Daemon Targaryen, played, I think, wonderfully by Matt Smith. I knew Matt Smith primarily as the Doctor in Doctor Who, so it was really strange for me to see him in a much different role, shall we say. He's hamming it up, he's having fun, he's the bad guy we all love to hate. I think he's doing an excellent job with the character, and he's certainly become one of the most compelling screen presences in House of the Dragon. And in the form of Daemon Targaryen, we actually have a pretty solid comparison in Scottish history. So let's dwell first, just for a moment, on Daemon. He is capable of extraordinary violence. We see this in his encounter with the forces arrayed against him in the Stepstones of the Crab Feeder, where he pretty much goes to take on an army single-handed, raises the flag of truce, and then actually is setting up an ambush. So he's devious, he's violent, he's quite emotional. We see this time and time again. He is capable of tactics and strategy, but he seems to be more led by impulse and his heart's desires rather than what is good in the long run. And because he is so terrifying and violent, he more often than not tends to get his way when he does act impulsively. He also married for lands. His wife, who was Rhea Royce in the Vale, was the heir to a lot of lands and several mighty castles, and he completely ignores her. Doesn't even, go to visit her until a recent episode where he goes to visit her with very sinister purposes in mind. So generally speaking, bit of a force for chaos, very violent, led by impulse, feared across the land. I can think of no better comparison than Alexander Stewart, popularly known as the Wolf of Badenoch. He lived in the mid to late 14th century. He was the fourth illegitimate son of King Robert II of Scotland, younger brother to the man who would become King Robert III. And again, Daemon Targaryen in House of the Dragon is the younger brother to the king, Viserys, and he was the youngest son of both their fathers, King Jaehaerys. Good luck keeping all that straight. I barely managed myself. So here in the form of Alexander Stewart, he pretty wantonly murdered his enemies in quite horrible ways. He raised lands all across Scotland, really just lashing out at anyone who was possible opposition to him. He ran protection rackets. He broke standards of decency pretty much wherever he could. All this led to him actually being censored and sort of prescribed by no less than the Pope. In retaliation, Alexander Stewart burnt Elgin Cathedral to the ground. So there again, we have an incredibly destructive act, really done just for revenge rather than any grand strategy. After that happened, and after he was forced to be divorced from his wife, Euphemia of Ross, he kind of faded into the background a little bit. There are stories about his death occurring at the hands of the devil, for instance, but we don't actually know for sure how he died. His tomb is in Dunkeld Cathedral. I think safe to say that Daemon Targaryen isn't going to go out with a whimper. He's going to go out with a pretty fiery bang, if I had to put my money on anything. There's another parallel with Daemon Targaryen. I mentioned his wife, Rhea Royce. Here she's seen on a hunt in the moment she encounters Daemon Targaryen when he comes to visit her. He goes with murderous intent. And there was an event very similar to this, which happened at a castle which was actually constructed originally by Alexander Stewart, the Wolf of Badenoch, near Fortingal. It's Garth Castle. The Stewarts of Garth inhabited it for centuries. And in an area just below Garth Castle, in quite a sort of deep ravine, there is a rocky area where a pretty terrible incident took place. And I've just got to look at my notes here because, again, I've been trying to update this as much as possible, but it means I've not had as much time to imbibe it. So this is all a bit new. But at Garth Castle, there lived Nigel Stewart, and this is about 100 years after the Wolf of Badenoch's time. Nigel was a bit of a villain himself. He raised several neighborhood castles. He was quite punishing on anyone who stood against him, and King James V actually ended up sort of banning him and imprisoning him in his own castle at the end of the day. But there was a pretty tragic event which occurred with his wife, Mariotta McQueen. She was down by the river one day when the Chronicle of Fortingal records how Mariotta was, and I'm quoting from the Chronicle here, killed by Alexander Stewart, a different Alexander Stewart than the Wolf of Badenoch. Again, it's tough to keep all this straight, but she was killed by Alexander Stewart in the burn below the castle of Garth, negligently through the blow of a stone, as if Alexander just casually discarded a stone over his shoulder and it just so happened to strike her. Odds are that Nigel conspired with Alexander, his kinsman, to murder his wife. For what reason, we'll never know. But it's interesting to note that in the book that House of the Dragon is based off of, Rhea Royce does not die by Daemon Targaryen's hand. She does indeed seem to die in a hunting accident. So we have two murders of powerful men's wives under dubious circumstances, attributed to accident, but almost certainly the result of violence. Another comparison, more expanding out to the different creatures and peoples of Westeros that we can make with Scottish history, and I'll be rather quick about this one, is the Children of the Forest. They are a quite magical, mystical race who were forced back into island and forest strongholds by the incursions of the First Men. So they are this sort of, not mythical because they actually existed, but we can use that term, mythical race, which existed in the mist before time. And many people in Westeros are convinced that they were never real, or that if they were real, they certainly aren't around anymore. Of course, we learned that they still are around, and they most certainly were real in the world of Westeros. And the comparison there is with a peoples who have been pretty misrepresented throughout the annals of Scottish archaeology, although that's starting to be corrected, thankfully. The Picts, depicted here in a early modern illustration as impossibly sort of barbarous painted peoples, integrated with nature, incorporating a lot of the tropes of the noble savage that were quite popular in sort of imperial narratives at the time that this illustration was made. So there are certainly those connotations, of sort of lesser mystical peoples who had to be taken aside in order that the modern world, or the world that we know, could come to pass. Obviously, we can see the problems with this narrative, but like the Children of the Forest, the Picts were thought to be diminutive peoples who lived in subterranean tunnels and houses, which were the remains of things like brochs and cairns. We now know, of course, that they did build many of those sites, but they were probably about the same size of us, maybe an inch or two off, given modern health standards, but that's about it. Otherwise, they thought and acted much as any of us would today if we were in their positions. One of the things that really struck me, one of those moments where I literally leapt out of my seat because I thought, oh my goodness, that is straight out of Scottish history, are the designs left by the Children of the Forest in rocky surfaces and glens and ritual areas across Westeros. Here we see them carved on the caverns beneath Dragonstone when Jon Snow takes Daenerys Targaryen into those caverns to show her the story of the White Walkers and convince her that they were real and that they need to unite to fight against this existential threat. As soon as I saw that, and I'm sure that several people watching right now are thinking the same thing, I thought there's no way that one of the set designers didn't take a look and do some research and stumble across rock art. This is an example of cup and ring motifs at Achnabrech, which is in Kilmartin Glen. Kilmartin Glen in Mid-Argyll is one of the best areas in all of Scotland to see rock art. There are dozens of incredible rock art sites in the area, some with hundreds of individual motifs. Another example here, also at the edge of Kilmartin Glen at Ormeig. So you can see some of the different patterns here, almost looking a bit more like flying saucers and grouped cup marks. So there's no way, at least in my mind, that someone in the show didn't stumble across this and just insert them more or less directly onto those cave walls under Dragonstone. Another fun comparison, at least aesthetically here, are the faces carved into the heart trees. These are the most important of the weirwood trees in Westeros, which the old gods were said to see through, hence the faces with the eyes, and the eyes tend to bleed. Now, whether that's sap or something more mysterious in the world of Westeros is kind of left to our imagination. But again, seeing this on screen, there's a specific place in Scotland where I thought, it's a dead ringer. Very different circumstances brought it about, but nonetheless, what do you make of this? This is a face carved in stone at Dunino Den. That's D-U-N-I-N-O Den. It's a couple miles south of St. Andrews. It's an absolutely incredible atmospheric place. It's been used as a ritual center for well over 2,000 years. But unlike the faces in the weirwood trees that I just showed you, this face is pretty new. Now, it does sit alongside carved Christian crosses, which do go back to likely the 6th or 7th centuries. But this face, locals insist, was only created within the last sort of 30 or 40 years. So we're not looking at an ancient depiction of the old gods, but rather a much newer interpretation of what someone felt might linger in a place like Dunno Den. But in terms of dead ringers, hard to top it, unless, of course, we're looking at someone like Tormund Giantsbane. He is the archetypal wildling. I almost said Pict there. The wildlings were very much inspired by the Picts, but also by Neolithic peoples in Scotland. Of course, there's parallels as well with indigenous peoples living across the Arctic, especially when it comes to the seal skins and the dense furs that they were wearing. So I'm not saying that George R. R. Martin just took from Scottish history, far from it. He's a lover of history and of broad swathes of history. So in everything like this, unless it's a one-for-one inspiration, there are multiple things going into any given society or individual. But here, Tormund Giantsbane is the archetypal wildling. He really matches the description left by Tacitus, who described the Picts as having red gold hair and massive limbs. And I think if you describe Tormund Giantsbane that way to his face, he would be pretty flattered by that. And there was another facial reconstruction done in the last couple of years. I believe it was by the University of Dundee, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think I've got the attribution on the next slide. Again, in terms of dead ringers, the inspiration for the wildlings, no doubt in my mind. Yes, University of Dundee were the Picts. This is a man who lived in the late Pictish period, who was found, I believe, at Rosemarkie. This is, he's capturing the red gold hair, those sort of broad features, looks quite strong, but also, he's got some heart in those eyes, much like Tormund Giantsbane. I appreciate that. Going into part 4 now, the Wheels of War. This will be a relatively short section, but there's a couple instances that I'd really like to draw your attention to, especially with House of the Dragon. Here we have Princess Rhaenyra with her dragon looming pretty menacingly behind her, evoking the power of dragons in the world of Westeros. Now, we saw this in the original series and, of course, the books, Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire, that the side who has dragons is almost always going to win the war. There are a couple exceptions to that. For instance, the Targaryens failed to subdue the lands of Dorne in the south of Westeros because the Dornish found almost sort of guerrilla-style tactics to deal with the dragons. And we see that Daemon Targaryen in House of the Dragon is struggling to defeat the crab feeders, men in the Stepstones, because they're hiding in caves. So a dragon isn't an automatic victory, but if you're a side without dragons, going against people with dragons, I don't like your odds. So what is the parallel here in Scottish history, and indeed medieval history in general? Of course, we could look to more modern weapons, but given that Westeros is a fundamentally medieval world, we're really looking at gunpowder weapons, massive pieces of artillery like Mons Meg, a huge bombard capable of hurling massive stones nearly 2 miles distant with extraordinary force. It was such a feared weapon that it often didn't even have to be used. Just threatening to roll it out against a rebellious lord would be enough to cow him and say, nope, there's no way my castle can go up against that. I'm just going to submit rather than risk having my lands being devastated and having my favorite castle being destroyed by Mons Meg or similar artillery pieces. So here we see the cannon, and the parallel again being the dragon, not just as a potent weapon on the battlefield, but as a deterrent off the battlefield as well. They're so strong and so asymmetrical in their power if you're going up against someone who doesn't have them, that just the threat of using them can be enough to win the war. Here we have a depiction of the castle of Harrenhal, which we see ruinous both in House of the Dragon and in Game of Thrones. It was the most powerful castle and the largest castle in Westeros by a long measure. Tywin Lannister famously said that 1,000,000 men could march on Harrenhal and 1,000,000 men would be repulsed. So as long as you're in there with even a few dozen soldiers, the enemy can come at you all day. They're not going to get anywhere near you. Unless you might have noticed something. Harrenhal is a ruin here. It obviously was destroyed at some point. All it took was one dragon. Aegon the Conqueror on his dragon Balerion the Black Dread flew to Harrenhal and burned the entire place down in less time than it would take most of us to eat dinner. So it goes to show you that the most powerful fortification up against an overwhelming weapon is still probably not going to be enough. And a parallel that we have in Scotland is Tantallon Castle. It was reckoned to be one of the most powerful castles in Scotland. It was also one of the last true medieval castles, in the sense that it was a huge curtain wall with a keep sort of built into the curtain wall. So there's not a whole lot to it other than that massive facade cutting off the promontory that it's situated on. It was pretty well impregnable. In fact, there was a rhyme sung about Tantallon by various armies who besieged it unsuccessfully over the years, which went ding doon Tantaloon, ding doon Tantaloon, macabrig to the bass. And what that means at Scots is that effectively you're more likely to be able to build a bridge out to Bass Rock out in the sea than you are to be able to get inside Tantallon Castle. That's the spirit of it, basically. Forget it. It was breached, however, but not until 1651, I believe, when Cromwell's quite advanced artillery were arrayed against it. Up until then, it stood strong against even a 20,000 strong army arrayed against it in the early 16th century. Here we have a sky view of the Battle of the Bastards. This was one of the biggest battles in the late seasons of Game of Thrones, with Jon Snow's wildlings going up against the army of the Boltons and very nearly getting killed to the last man. Here, as you can see, it is not looking good at all for Jon Snow's forces, who are the sort of clustered rabble in the middle, with the Ramsay Bolton forces arrayed in that quite sort of well-organized ring of shields and spears around them. In that kind of situation, there's really not much you can do except stand there and wait your turn to get skewered. And of course, the parallel here is the Battle of Bannockburn, where that's almost exactly what happened to the English army under Edward II. In this case, the Scots were the ones with the spears. They arrayed themselves in formations called schiltrons or schiltrons, which were, think of them as giant prickly steamrollers of spear points. They would be incredibly densely packed with almost no wiggle room between one man and the one next to them. The difference between the Battle of Bannockburn and the Battle of the Bastards is that the Bolton soldiers used shields. They likely did not use shields at the Battle of Bannockburn because their spears were about 16, 17 feet long. So you needed two hands on each spear just to be able to wield it. The Scottish army was able to force the English army down into a wedge of marshy ground in between two burns, where they didn't have anywhere to go, at least easily, and the Scots basically just pressed forward with their spears until the English army broke and fled the field altogether. Here we can see up close and viscerally one man trying to escape that ring of spears and being stabbed by a swordsman within the ranks. And that actually also echoes the fact that at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce peppered soldiers mostly from the Western Isles and Gaeltacht area, armed with axes and swords, to pop out and finish off fallen knights that the spearmen had brought down to the ground. Here we see the members of the Clan Ranald Trust forming a schiltron at their medieval village of Duncarron in the Carron Valley, which is another really great place I recommend you check out, especially if you like living history. On to the final part now, the laws of gods and men. There are giants in Westeros, not many, but at the time we arrive in Game of Thrones, there are still a couple around, including the big man here, One, as he's affectionately known. I believe his full name is Weinczok Darwan, which really does evoke the names of the giants that in the foundational myth of Scotland, Brutus was alleged to have encountered when him and the Phoenicians and the Trojans and everyone, they sort of mash all this history up in the foundation myth, arrived on the shores of Britain. There were giants roaming the land that they had to fight off. So how does a Westerosi giant compare to a Scottish or more generally a British giant? Well, in terms of size, not well. A lot of the giants in Scottish and wider British lore were absolutely massive. We're talking hundreds of feet tall. Here, Weinczok Darwan, who was considered to be pretty big, topped out at, I believe, 17 or 18 feet tall. So he probably wouldn't even come up to the heel of a lot of the giants that were reckoned to be kicking around this land in the sort of prehistoric era. Unfortunately, in terms of intelligence, they also don't come up great. The giants in Westeros are somewhat intelligent. They have a sort of simple language. They certainly are able to communicate with other magical creatures quite effectively. They're just not that well able to communicate with people. Possibly for good reason, because people hunted them down and drove them off their lands. Why would you want to talk to them, right? They also have some clothes, but nothing too sophisticated. Poor 1-1 in this battle wasn't even given a proper weapon. I was crying out for him to just be given a tree limb or a massive mace, anything. Whereas the giants in Scottish history were basically large people who had houses and were extremely intelligent, read books, crafted weapons of very, very high standards. One example of that, of course, is Finn McCool and Fingal and the Fianna and the wider legends shared across Scotland and Ireland, referencing the Fianna, the warrior band of heroic giants. The Fianna were, again, reckoned to be hundreds of feet tall. Even their hounds were absolutely massive. And to give you an idea of how large the hounds belonging to the Fianna were, this is the Dogstone, just outside Oban. You can see Denali Castle in the distance there. The story was that Finn McCool tied up his hound, Bran, when he went hunting in the Hebrides, and the dogs, you know, dogs, they get anxious for their owners to come back, was racing around the stone so rapidly that the rope actually wore away this groove in the bottom of the stone. So if his dog was that big, you hate to think of how large the actual giant was. Now, we know that the stone was actually eroded through millions of years of the coming and going of ice and tides, but that's a lot less exciting and a lot less adorable, I think, than a doggy running around. We have a little bit of a parallel with the White Walkers. It's not a perfect one, but in looking around the annals of Scottish lore, there is something that fits certain properties of the White Walkers. They are elemental beings, fundamentally at one with the ice and the winter themselves. In fact, they bring the winter with them wherever they go. Conscious of time, so I'm just going to rattle through relatively quickly, but the comparison here possibly is the Cailleach. The Cailleach, or the Cailleachber, was a divine hag or creation goddess in more generous terms. This is a possible representation of the Cailleach in the form of the Ballachulish figure held now in the National Museum of Scotland. The Cailleach was again, creation goddess. She is alleged to have created the mountains of the Highlands. She created places like Ailsa Crag when she was crossing over the sea with rocks in her apron, but she had a hole in her apron, so one of the rocks fell out and became Ailsa Crag. She also brings winter to the land. One story about how she does that is by going to wash her great plate in the Corryvreckan whirlpool. When she does that, she then hangs her great plate up to dry. Ice crystals form on the plate, and those ice crystals get blown by the winter winds across the land, bringing winter to what we know as Scotland. And in the spring, on May Day, her subjects have to ceremonially revolt against her with fire festivals to drive back the long night of winter into the mountain fastnesses. So you can see it's not perfect, but a reasonable comparison to the White Walkers in some respects. Although the Cailleach was not just a force of destruction like the White Walkers were, she was also a force for creation and could be quite generous to those who accommodated her. For instance, if she was wandering in a glen and someone offered her shelter, they would be given her favor. So it's not all bad with the Cailleach. Here is one depiction of the Cailleach by an artist, which I think sort of captures the spirit of her. Finally, now I'm getting on to the last comparison. This is the Red Wedding, probably the most shocking event in all of Game of Thrones, which is really saying something because it kind of built its reputation on shocking events. Here we have Robb Stark starting to click that things are not going the way he thought in the Castle of the Freys. He has been betrayed, and him and several other members of the Stark family are about to be brutally murdered. Now, the reason that this was so shocking was not just because of the violence, inherent in something like this. It was because Robb and the rest of the Starks were guests under the Frey's roof. Guest right is incredibly important in Westeros. Time and time again, there are these morality tales throughout the Westerosi legendarium of people breaking guest right, say a host murdering their guest or a guest murdering their host, and being condemned for eternity to be remembered as the most villainous of villains possible, or even to be cursed and turned into deformed creatures as a punishment from the gods. So it was something that was taken incredibly seriously by most. So when it was violated, it was extra shocking. And here we do have a direct inspiration with the Black Dinner, which occurred in the year 1440 at Edinburgh Castle. The Black Dinner was effectively a trap laid by Crichton and Livingston, who were advisors to the young King James II. James II was only 10 years old at the time, so he wasn't doing much pulling of the strings. It was his advisors who were looking out more for themselves than for the good of the realm at this point. And that happens time and time again when you have a child king on the throne. More often than not, it turns into a bit of a dogfight amongst the people put in charge of taking care of them and managing the kingdom's affairs in their stead. So Crichton and Livingston, under the pretense of the king, extended an invitation to William, the Earl of Douglas, who was only about 16 or 17 years old at the time, the same age as Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. And they wanted the Earl of Douglas to come to Edinburgh Castle to speak with the king, have a feast, smooth things over, and William accepted this invitation. He attended the feast at Edinburgh Castle with his younger brother David and an attendant as well, and probably a few others in tow. And it all seemed to be going well, at least at the start. James II seemed to really warm to him, almost as a bit of a cool older brother feeling. You can imagine them talking about, who's your favorite knight? What's your favorite castle? You killed a boar? Oh, wow, that's amazing. Talking about stuff that teenagers would talk about, really. And then it all went very, very sour very quickly. The story goes, and none of this can be substantiated, but the story goes that a servant came in when a piper started to play, and the servant was carrying a black bull's head, which you can see on the bottom of the illustration there, on a silver platter. And the black bull's head is a symbol of impending doom and death. And what exactly happened next, we don't know, but the story goes that William and his younger brother were slaughtered right then and there at the dinner table. More likely, they were brought out in front of Edinburgh Castle, given a mock trial for treason, of which they were not guilty, and hanged, drawn, and quartered, given a pretty brutal traitor's death. Again, as guests of the king and the nobility at Edinburgh Castle, this was shocking, and rhymes and ill tales about the Black Dinner spread around Edinburgh and the rest of Scotland within just a few days of this happening. So it was reviled at the time, as well as by us now, with 6 centuries between us and those events. There is another inspiration, which I'll just glance over because it's so well known, which is the Massacre of Glencoe. And again, we encounter here the concept of murder under trust. George R. R. Martin is very strongly on the record saying that he did indeed get the Red Wedding from a combination of the Black Dinner in 1440 and the Massacre of Glencoe on the 12th of February, 1692. So with that, we're wrapping up. And what I'd like to leave you with, it's certainly the thing that keeps me motivated, the reason that I got into fantasy in the first place, and hopefully the reason that you're interested in it as well, and the reason you're interested in history, is this wonderful quote by George R. R. Martin, which is, we read fantasy to find the colors again, I think, to taste strong spices and hear the songs the sirens sang. There's something old and true in fantasy that speaks to something deep within us. They can keep their heaven. When I die, I'd rather go to Middle-earth. And in that spirit, I hope you all go out of this talk encouraged to explore some archaeological and historic sites near you, possibly some of the ones I've mentioned during this talk, because I really do believe that with those in mind, Westeros is all around us. Thank you very much.